Hey there, welcome back to Garbeardia. We have for you the next chapter of the Emily Braun series. Additionally, be sure to stop by the Ko-fi link to help support me and the voice actors. Stop by our affiliates, Redcon 1, Skull Splitter Dice, and War Games Delivered. And yeah, you guys know what happened in Discord if you're already there, so you guys know how I am. So let's just push forward together as best we can. Enjoy the chapter.
Chapter 14. The Strip. As Emily and Davin's motorbikes rumbled down the side road that ran parallel to the tarmac, the group caught glimpses of those who also had to make crash landings in their haste to avoid the summoned whirlwind. Fixed wing and rotor wing crafts lay riddled around the ground or fences, their occupants having long made their insurance reports and left to the Strip to find a room. One of the larger airliners had not been so lucky, the large form having been torn down from the sky by the torrents of wind on its approach and cast into the spare, empty parking lot as if it were an errant plaything. Emily lifted up her helmet visor as she slowed near the parked emergency vehicles, the smoking hulk of the fallen Boeing 737 laying bare like the scuttled bones of a whale. Marill's boots thudded to a halt beside Emily Zundep, and she too peered out at the fallen plane, ears perked. "Looks like it was a full flight," she mused, wiggling her pinky finger in her long, horsey ear. Emily stared morosely at the stack of body bags that stood like a wall in front of the emergency vehicles, many of which were folded over at the bottom for their smaller occupants. The dipping sun cast a red haze over everything it touched, giving the affair a few more notches on the sinister scale. "Yeah, looks like it." A pair of human workers flipped over a pair of seats to expose the mangled body of a stewardess, her once neat uniform now malformed with her own blood in the ash of the plane that had been burning around her. Emily saw her hand was poking out above the rest of her, fingers bent and curled as if she had been holding on to something, and Emily looked away when they pulled another small child out from under the stewardess's broken form. With a slap of her helmet visors, she took off at a high rev, throwing Tarj roughly into the back of his seat.
Emily, what the hell?
Tarj began, but he could tell from the shaking of Emily's shoulders as she worked the gearbox that she was crying, and he didn't push it any further, instead choosing to just resettle into the sidecar with his M2040B between his knees and its barrel over his shoulder. Davin took a few more moments to observe the crash site before twitching his boot tip and putting his Indian chieftain into gear, rumbling away after Emily and the cantering centaur while Yopuya snoozed in his own sidecar. Emily's mind burned with rage and self-anguish. She knew the only reason that plane went down, among the many others out in the desert, was her. The whatever the hells that wanted her dead brought that plane down in a mad dash to take her down as well in one fell swoop. And the architect that put her on this mission, she was the one to blame. Her bleary eyes looked towards Tarj, who was looking around at the encroaching bulb-lit buildings with an easy smile, and his words came back into her head.
What do you think, Emily? 3 of us left.
Her own voice answered back. "What do you mean?"
At the end of it all, how many of us are going to be left?
She bit at her lip as she sniffed. The helicopter going down almost took all of them out in one go. How many close calls did she have left in her at this point? 1? 2? What moment on her mission will be when her friends have to punch their cards and leave her behind?
Do not think of such things. Eyes on the road ahead,
the Torque whispered within her thoughts, and she shook her head with another sniff. "How many more are going to die because of me?" she asked it, rolling back the throttle to an even temper.
As many as need to. What is the loss of a few hundred at the salvation of millions, Emily?
Emily sniffed again, this time angrily. "Ah, yes, that old chestnut. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few."
And it is said for a reason. You do shoulder a great weight, but the completion of your task is paramount in the survival of your world. If you fail, a single accident like the one behind us will look like a grain of sand on the beach of slain and damned souls. For them, the death was instant. For those devoured by the beast of the shadows, their pain and torment will last until even their souls are naught but dregs on the astral winds.
Emily slammed her left hand down on its handlebar, spooking Tarj as the Zundep did a little jig, but Emily made no further attempts to speak to the Torque as the group made their way onto the strip proper. Davin pulled up beside Emily, Yopuya snoring lazily despite the brightness around her. Maril seemed to be on the lookout for something, but her eyes still caught glimpses of the fanfare that made up the sidewalks and theater entrances. Emily didn't pay attention to any of it, her eyes level with the road as her mind roiled with her own aggravated thoughts. The Sicilian and Pompey's palace slid by on her left and right, their glow streaking off her helmet and visor as her body rocked with the course of the road. Her mind's eye fluttered back to the sight of the dead stewardess, the child she died trying to protect, the stacks of body bags that lined the road, then all the way back to the muddy mound of flesh she had first encountered out in Walla Walla. Another voice entered her mind as she changed lanes to the right to avoid a truck stopped in the left lane, the driver busily talking up a dancer despite the flow of traffic around him, and her knuckles clenched and crackled as she reheard Mela's words. Dangerous and perilous is their friendship, death always a part in their company. Emily cranked her handlebars hard to the right, ducking randomly into one of the large front parking areas of a casino hotel. Tarj let out a yell of surprise while Maril calmly kept pace, trotting up beside Emily as Davin pulled his Indian right in behind them, and Emily quickly parked into one of the vacant temporary guest spots. The spots were large enough to fit most RVs and other scouting vehicles as they found their permanent parking place after getting their room, and this allowed Davin to tidily pull up next to Emily. Davin pulled off his helmet with a chuckle while Yopuya giggled happily as she woke, clapping her wing claws together. Maril shifted her shoulder harness and screwed up her eyes at the flamboyant and stylized entrance of the casino. The cat's paw? What kind of place? Oh my god, they have these, Maril said in a hushed voice, letting out a sinful laugh as she pointed out what she was looking at. In front of the porte cochere were a pair of men standing behind a small and tidy desk, while behind them grand doors opened up into the busy grand vestibule. Emily squinted, her eyes not as good as Maril's, but she could in fact make out a pair of cat ears? Emily asked as she rocked back and forth from Tarj leaving her sidecar. Davin sent out a quick text on his phone before putting it back into his pocket, and he looked up and around at the building.
Haven't been here in only a few years, but this place is new. Must have been built up after Meryl's last solo mission.
Makes it 2 years and 2 months old then, Maril answered back, and she leaned down to righten her front hoof boots.
Yopo want to touch ears,
Yopuya cried out eagerly, and it was only the quick and well-trained reactions of Tarj that kept her from sprinting towards the doors, instead finding herself wrapped up in the dusty green arms of the half-orc.
Yoipua, I am not going to jail with you again.
Tarj growled, and he hissed as Yopuya angrily bit down onto his well-muscled forearm.
Damn it, Yoi, let go of me.
ears.
Yopuya snarled back, while Emily sighed, running her hand along her braid to bring it out of her jacket. It'll do. I don't really care at the moment, she said with a sigh, but her dour mood was buffeted by the excitement of everyone else as they all made their way towards the front desk, weapons slung. As Emily drew nearer to the greeting desk, she had to admit the curious humanoids in front of her did cause a small smile to break her lips. It wasn't the cat ears per se, but the overall look they were giving off. They looked quite bored, as if it was their normal daily job, and she saw that one was quietly playing Pokemon on an old battered Game Boy. More curious was how they were dressed, as each of their necks sported highly stylized torques of their own, one in silver and the other in gleaming copper. Their clothes reminded her heavily of Gaelic-styled clothing, as both of them wore tall leather boots, of which shaggy linen pants were tucked in. Around their waists they wore thick leather belts adorned with small bells, and most curiously was the half-kilt they wore around their right side, the fabric fluttering softly in the breeze that came down through the archway. Their bastion long-sleeved shirts were tidy, tucked into the belts and highly embroidered all the way down to the cuffs. However, the one playing the old Game Boy had his sleeves rolled up, and Emily couldn't see how his ended. The other humanoid sleeves ended in some kind of dancing animal that Emily knew not of, but they looked like some kind of elk. As they approached, both of the humanoids reacted to their advance, eyes flicking up with the motion, and the one with the rolled sleeves hastily stowed away his device, despite the fact the sounds of Pocket Monster still battling echoed out from his pocket. To Emily, they looked a lot like humans did, except they were a few feet shorter, sported feline ears, tails, and long nails that tapered to fine points.
Hello, welcome to the cat's paw.
The other said, bowing his head in a hostly manner while the other bounced his off the top of the desk, having bowed too low and still trying to tuck away his game system. The one with the non-rolled sleeves closed his eyes, hissed something at rolled sleeves in their native language, then opened up a small section of the tidy desk, showing a tablet glowing underneath.
How can we be of service? Are you here on a dive?
The cat-eared humanoid nodded towards their many weapons, and Emily stepped forward, and Rolled Sleeves swallowed slightly as he realized Emily was as strapped as they come, and had more scars than most men he had seen. "We're here on personal business," she said, and unzipped her jacket, flapping it to cool off. While on the bike, things stayed pretty cool under the jacket, but off the bike, the leather quickly heated up. Emily squinted and saw their names were Eamon and Luch, the latter being the more professional.
As that may be, you cannot carry weapons into the cat's paw unless you pay the insurance fee.
Luch stated and began tapping the screen of his tablet. Emily heard something jangle and saw these folk also had tails, as Luch had swayed out from behind the half-killed. "And what may that be?" Emily asked.
9,000 per weapon.
Luch said with a polite smile, then raised his hand palm up towards a secondary building some yards to their left.
You can store your weapons in our...
"The fee is fine," Emily said, cutting across Luch as she pulled out her billfold.
How many weapons do you have?
Luch asked as Eamon stood up on his toes, a notepad in hand. Emily held open her leather jacket, exposing her handgun as well as the rest of her mare's leg. While beside her, Muriel hefted her custom M2. Luch and Eamon inhaled sharply as they saw the scars on Emily's stomach and chest, her tank top not hiding much below her rib cage. "My 75 in mare's leg, her M2, the half-orc's machine gun," Emily began, and started listing off the rest of the weapons on her party's person as well as the ones on or in the motorbikes. Eamon gaped down at his notepad before turning towards Luch and speaking in their mother tongue. His ears were low on his head, more in worry than alarm, and the two spoke quietly back and forth to one another.
Interesting. They also wear torques. Are they of this world? I don't remember them.
"No, I'm pretty sure they're from another plane. I've never seen a half-kilt before."
They are giving me an odd deja vu. Sound like the people from the village that found me.
"Getting homesick or something?" Emily asked, and she heard the torque snort, but say nothing more. Luch cleared his throat to speak, but stopped as he realized that Yapuya was among them. The harpy was still chewing on Tarja's arm in a fit, her wing claws reaching out towards Eamon. Luch looked from Yapuya to Emily.
This sum is quite large. Would you prefer to use a physical payment of some kind? My cause errors on your card. I got this one,
Davin said, and fiddled with a pouch he had on the side of a bag he had slung over his shoulder. After a few moments, he fished out a fist-sized star ruby and placed it in front of Luch, who blinked at it politely while Eamon looked as if he was going to lose his mind at the sight of such a valuable gem being handled so casually. Luch looked up from the gem to Emily.
This will suffice for both your fee and 1 week's lodging at our VIP suite. Will this suffice, Miss?
"Bronze, and that'll do," Emily said, and as Luch tapped on his tablet, she looked up to Davin. "You just had that thing chilling in your damn pack pocket?" Davin shrugged.
We got plenty of them.
"Yeah, but at least put him in a pocket on your body or something," Emily muttered, and Davin gave her a sardonic salute.
Ah, yes, ma'am.
"Shut up!" As Luch finished up on his tablet, a light buzzing came from inside the desk, and soon Luch had finished out a card for each of the party. However, Luch instead gave Yapuya's to Tarj, not wanting to find out what the harpy did when she was off leash.
These are your room cards. The VIP suite entitles you free drinks at any of the bars. However, meals are still going to require payment. Please be sure not to flash your weapons at anyone or have them openly displayed while at our drinking establishments. Do you have any questions?
Muriel raised a hand. "What kind of joint is this?"
We at the Cat's Paw seek to blend the charm of our world and this modern one. You'll find that our casino and hotel are much like that of the Sicilian. Main road will take you from one end of the building to the other, and we are partially on the ground. Above the third floor are the rooms, while below are our restaurants, bars, shopping center, bathhouse, and spa. Please enjoy your stay, and do note that your VIP parking spot is also on your card.
"Huh," Muriel said, raising her eyebrows as the party turned to go park their motorbikes. The VIP parking garage was guarded unlike the normal parking garage, manned by humans in important-looking suits and even more important-looking hardware. Their spot was near the elevator, which was handy, and they went up the elevator to their room to drop off their equipment. The hallways of the Cat's Paw reminded Emily of a forest passage, if that made any sense. It was something about the vine-textured chestnut carpet, the carved wood of the door frames, how they painted the ceiling and walls in warm colors of green. It just reminded her of going on a hike. All it needed were the sounds of birds instead of people banging their headboard against their wall. But this was a hotel, after all. Their own room was a sprawling apartment with multiple rooms, and if Emily had to reckon, it could have comfortably housed multiple families. The furniture and decorations said classic manor home to her. But if the manor was designed by an elf and then furnished by a halfling who was really into pissing off their relative with shows of wealth, Tarj and Davin both wanted to go to a bar, and according to the brochure map, there was a sports bar on the second level, which left Emily, Maril, and Yopuya to their own devices. The three realized that their devices would have to be triggered far earlier than thought, as the bathrooms of the room only held a toilet and a basin. Maril, quite fussed, called down to the large front desk to complain, and was told that the lack of bathing furnishings was to make sure those in the hotel enjoyed the bathhouse to its fullest extent, and experienced the Kauturkanak culture. Since most of the party smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and gore, they decided that they would have to get this part out of the state done and over with early, like ripping off a Band-Aid. Emily, Maril, and Yopuya stepped out of their room, down the hallway, and popped out of an elevator on the first floor. Before them, well, there was in fact an actual cobbled stone road running down the main pathway, on which guests and workers bustled back and forth on their way. Maril and Yopuya shared a breathy chuckle as they stepped out into the roadway and looked around. While Emily blinked up at the Gaelic-looking medieval buildings and homes around them, the inner lighting of the casino was mimicking the sun outside, casting shadows of evening about while buildings cast the glow of lanterns and LED bulbs. "Man, it almost feels like we're back at home," Maril mused as she patted the exposed outer timbers of a nearby cantina, out of which the scent of chicken enchiladas and mole sauce wafted. Yopuya grabbed Emily's hand with her wing claw and gestured towards an odd-looking outcrop of another home, this one looking like a normal residence but actually being a gift shop.
Emily, look! Harpy post! You boy leaving those on home plane.
"A harpy post?" Emily asked, as the little outcrop could be mistaken for a jutting closet or even a latrine from how it hung over the side of the home.
Yes, harpy post, good luck. Means home gets mail faster than other homes. Your pa always bring mail to post building before all others.
Yopuya smiled up at the little jutting room with a reminiscent smile.
Elves who live in building always give your pa fresh frogs and meat at night, always fresh straw and hay to sleep. Never mind when your pa bring friends to sleep during rain. Very nice elves.
My town looked a lot like this one, except we used tiles on our roofs and our homes were clay-sided. Nice and tidy, Maril said, pointing around to a few buildings to Emily. "Look, even these have senar doors." As she pointed, Emily saw that some of the buildings sported two separate doors, one as per normal and another on rollers, much like a barn door. Emily looked up at Maril, eyebrows raised. "Looks like a normal barn door to me." Maril snorted. "Well, yeah, you guys are used to doors like this. But for us centaurs, they used to still be a brand spanking new thing and allowed us to fit into most buildings without the door swinging back around and catching our tails of butts. There's a famous story about a male centaur diplomat getting his nuts caught in the door when he stepped backwards to bow." Both Emily and Yopuya giggled and spluttered at the thought and made their way down the road, following the signs that said bathhouse with an arrow pointing them in the right direction. Each building, home, and residence along the road made Emily feel like she had been dragged backwards in time, despite the fact that many of them were selling electronics, fresh crepes, and at one point custom leather cowboy boots. Around the guests and normal denizens of Vegas, the same curious Kauturkanak people roamed, either charming guests playing side road games with them, or even at times giving history lessons and tours of its people. Emily saw a few that were acting strangely from a long wall that ran along a huge courtyard-looking construction, in which a small carnival was going in full medieval splendor. These Kauturkanak were hanging or lounging along the wall, giving sly winks and whistles to anyone who cast an eye at them. And unfortunately she caught the eye of a male who slid down the wall and stepped towards her. his half-kilt bearing the same colors of his fellows, red and yellow, with yellow hearts dotting here and there along the fabric.
Care to sleep soundly tonight? I'm exceptional at keeping your blankets warm,
he said, his smile flirtatious and fingers soft as he lightly laid them onto Emily's forearm. Aye, I know what those colors mean even if the human doesn't. She has no need for your services, bedfellow, Morrill barked, reaching over and flicking the Caturcanach's fingers away from Emily's arm. The sultry cat man pursed his lips, annoyed, but sauntered away, flicking his hips from side to side with a jingle of bells and a whip of the tail. Emily, looking from Morrill to the cat man, blinked a few times before it dawned on her just what was going on. Wait, what? Cat people hookers are in here? Oldest professions are hide the kill and extraplanar transients are allowed to practice in cultural centers. Morrill muttered, her ears pinned back as she bared her teeth at the other solicitors, who had made a move to come down off the wall to try and ply their own hand at the group. They instead slunk back up onto the wall, giving Morrill a sour look.
What if you want kitty hooker?
Yapuya said, tapping her wing claw on her chin. Yoy, could you at least try to set a good example? Morrill growled, while Emily chuckled as she was ushered onward by the centaur's urgent hands. As they moved forward, Yapuya pointed to a few of the yellow-clad workers on the wall and mouthed her room number, at which 2 males and a female gave her a thumbs up and a grin. After a few more yards of walking and scolding from Morrill, the bathhouse loomed into view, and the structure itself was sizable, dwarfing the other shops around it. Steam rose out of long, elegant chimneys and pillowed up into the air, arcing its way towards a vent placed just to suck it out and deposit it outside the building. The front of the building was decorated as if it was supposed to be placed on the edge of the town, as some bushes, trees, and bright flowers had been planted around its leading path. It was built using the same aesthetic of the other establishments in the little mock town, and could have been mistaken for a mill or a large weaving house. They were greeted at the doors by more Caturcanachs, these wearing the colors of green and blue on their half-kilts, and were shown the way to the women's only side of the bathhouse.
It is good you came as late as you did. You missed the rush times after dinner,
said one of the attendants, her ears bearing multiple loops and her feline tail wrapped with bells from tip to base. Emily couldn't help but wonder if the cat's paw was a haven for weebs and the like, as where else could you actually rub elbows with real-life cat girls?
Yes, around this time the more fit of your race come into Bath. After dinner, it looks as if sea creatures have beached themselves in order to catch the sun,
said the other, and the 2 Caturcanachs giggled happily as Morrill snorted and Emily guffawed. As per the rules on the bathhouse, bathers were only allowed a towel after stripping down in a locker room, the lockers of which were controlled by an intelligent thumb-scanning device attached to where the lock would be. Emily found it to clash with the overall wooden aesthetic of the place, but then again it made sense, as who would want to go into a bath and try to keep track of their key? Emily wrapped herself in the large plush tan towel, Morrill doing the same to her upper torso, while Yapuya dove headlong out of the locker room, her talons clicking on the stone tiles and body free to the wind as far as she was concerned. The 2 locker attendants watched the harpies sprint away with raised brows, and one turned to Emily, her silver ear loops shaking slightly.
Well, she's not one to be embarrassed easily, is she? Never seen someone sprint out of the changing room before.
That's our yoy, Emily said with a sigh and shifted her towel a bit. Just through the hallway, I take it? The other Caturcanach nodded politely.
Yes, just through there where the harpy's running. If you need anything else, there are attendants inside that can help you.
And we have to be naked, like the entire time? Morrill asked, and her hoofs fidgeted somewhat on the stone tiles. The Caturcanach with the rings in her ears giggled, her shoulders bobbing.
Yes, if you bring towels into the water, they can clog the filters if they get away from you. It is of course tradition to bath openly. This is more a social gathering more than it is washing. And if you bring your towel into the water, then all you have is a water-soaked towel that cannot be used to dry, and is considered a waste.
Yeah, whatever, I get it. Stupid, though. Morrill grumbled sourly, then turned, making her own way down the hallway. Emily smiled back to the attendants and turned, but not before her ears caught some of their comments as they echoed down the hallway.
Her scars. I know. Did you see them? She must have seen countless battles to get those. Who is she?
Emily drew her lips back into an annoyed line as she heard the comments, then pulled out the front of her towel a bit to look down at herself. It's not that many scars, is it?
Of course not. They are distinguished marks of honor.
the Torque answered, and Emily blew a raspberry out through her lips as she trudged on, feet slapping on the stone tiles as she followed Marill. They walked along the hallway, Emily overthinking her scars, until Marill stopped suddenly, causing Emily to walk into the centaur's rump and bounce off. Emily got a face full of Marill's tail, and she spluttered, smacking it away.
Marill, what the hell?
Emily, this thing is huge, Marill said, and Emily placed her hands on her towel-covered hips, angrily eyeballing the rear end of Marill.
Yeah, tell me about it. It takes up the entire picture.
Eh? Oh, sorry, Marill replied with a sheepish smile, and stepped out of the hallway into the large bathing room, exposing the interior to Emily.
Oh, dude!
Emily shouted and happily stepped out into the opening gamely, looking from side to side. The center of the female bathing section was a huge in-ground pool, ringed with stones and seats from where those who wished could sit and dangle their feet into the hot water, while inside the pool were seats and recesses to accommodate creatures of all sizes. In different locations were different bathing area styles. A shallower pool in a raised circle was a harpy area, and Emily could see Yopuya happily chittering away in harpish to other members of her kin while splashing in the waters, fluffing out her wings as she did. In a corner was a section labeled the Deep Pools, and a Goliath was chilling with a troll, the two venting about how annoying their children were now that they had gotten over 8 feet tall. Before Emily and Marill could get any further, one of the attendants padded up to them, giving Emily quite the shock as the female Katurkanach was wearing nothing but her half-kilt.
Pardon me,
She began, dipping her head slightly as she spoke. This Katurkanach wore no jewelry except for a small loop through her nose, and no bells as well.
but before you can enter the relaxation pools, you must wash. You may do so in the scrubbing tubs on the right.
As she turned and gestured, Emily and Marill leaned around her, looking at a large collection of ground-level tubs that appeared to cater to every size imaginable, even having a raised platform that seemed to be sized for pixies and other small fae who would view a regular tub as a swimming pool. The nose-ring Katurkanach nodded her head once more and walked past them, tail swinging, and Marill watched her go. Are they, like, naked all day or something? I don't think I could run around naked all day.
Well, you don't work here, and there's a tub over there that'll probably fit you,
Emily said, and she walked over towards a human-sized tub while pointing at a larger tub some yards away. Marill whistled as she trotted over gamely, bending down to inspect the large ground-level bathing tub. Hey, I'll be damned. I might be able to fully submerge myself. Usually I can only take showers. Can't remember the last time I had a bath in this realm, actually. Marill giddily giggled as she pulled away her towel and stepped down into the tub, sighing happily as the water began to bubble at her hooves, touching the bottom of the tub. Hey, it's got a jacuzzi setting! Emily looked down at her own tub and stepped down into it, pulling her towel away as she did. As soon as her feet touched down at the bottom of the ceramic basin, it began to vibrate, calculating her weight, then began to emit its own little stream of bubbles out of jets surrounding the walls of the tub. Emily gave out her own soft sigh as she stepped down into the water and splashed down in a heap, popping her feet up onto the rim and resting her head near the top edge.
Ah, yeah, good tub.
Emily groaned and settled in to let the jets go to work on her sore muscles. Curiously, the smell of gunpowder and helicopter fuel began to rise into the air with her steam, and she sniffed idly while Marill made an alarmed noise from across the way. Whoa! Hey now, I can do this myself! Emily! Emily leaned forward, bringing her head up, and saw that a small cluster of Katurkanach attendants were surrounding her, most of them holding brushes or bars of soap.
Come now, Centaurus. We rarely get your kind in here. Let us help you get cleaned. You can't reach everywhere.
One said, wiggling a brush with a toothy grin.
Yeah,
Said a smaller, more game-looking Katurkanach, whose hair was a mess of braids.
plus I want to braid your tail. Look how much hair there is.
Hey, wait a minute, yo, back up with that bottle!
What's even in there?
The Katurkanach, holding a large green bottle, gave it a wiggle.
Conditioner.
Yeah, sure it is, Marill growled, and she brought up her arms defensively, flexing her muscles.
Marill, just let them wash you.
Emily said with a laugh, then looked up to see she had her own pair of Katurkanachs waiting on either side of her tub.
Oh, hey.
We're here to wash your hair, miss. Grinnigan said you smelled of machines and fire while undressing.
The taller of the two said, and she was holding a smattering of bottles in her arms.
Jeez, do I smell that bad?
Emily asked, looking at the large collection of bottles.
Quite.
Said the other, and they both smiled politely. Emily sighed.
Well, all right, have at it, Marill.
Just sit there and let them brush you down. We both apparently stank.
Not as bad as the harpy. We had to pick out soggy tortilla chips from her washing basin. But as long as she was in it anyway, I don't think we even got soap on her.
The Caturcanach holding the bottles mused, setting down the glass vessels as her partner laughed at the memory. Morel was still unsure of the whole thing, but settled down, glowering into the water and crossing her arms across her chest protectively.
Fine, but if you guys do anything funny, I'm gonna turn you into paste with my hoofs,
Morel said hotly, but her attendants didn't seem too afraid as they began to pour shampoo all along her spine, then lathering it up with their hands. They had just gotten one side of the centaur sudsed up when Morel had an epiphany, turning to look over her shoulder at Emily, who had her eyes closed as the two Caturcanachs worked the soot out of her hair with wetted soft bristle brushes.
Hey, Emily, if we have female attendants, does that mean the males' washroom only has males?
Emily raised her head, opening an eye in a squint.
I guess. Why?
This is true,
said one of Morel's washers, who was happily scrubbing away with a long-handled brush.
The males of our clan do our duties the same on the other side of the bathhouse.
Morel laughed raucously, rubbing her hands together. Oh man, Taj is gonna be so pissed. Emily chuckled along with everyone else within earshot and happily hummed to herself as the deft fingers of her attendants undid her braid and worked shampoo around her scalp. Every once in a while, usually after the two dunked a pail of water over her head to clear the suds, Emily would open her eyes to see Morel and her own little centaur wash crew going about their duties. Morel was no slouch, using her own long-handled brush to scrub where she wouldn't allow her Caturcanach attendants to. After both of them were bathed and cleaned, their attendants pulled out hidden blow dryers tucked away in watertight hatches around the tub. The motors were hidden well under their feet, so the only sound was the gentle whoosh of air exiting the nozzle and blowing away the water from the air. While Emily only needed one, Morel needed several, causing some of the Caturcanachs to sputter as one side would blow water over the centaurs back into the face of the opposite attendant. Once Emily and Morel's hair were dry, they were quickly rebraided, tied off at the end with a bit of leather, and their attendants inclined their heads before striding away, taking all their bottles and brushes with them. Emily stood up from her own sudsy tub and kicked away the foam that stuck to her legs, and as she stepped out completely, the tub began to drain and clean itself before refilling with fresh hot water. Morel stood up from her own tub, shivered, then folded her arms across her chest as she trotted towards the larger bathing pool.
Cold, 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 cold. Whoa, shit!
She screeched as she had been so used to her hoof boots that her bare hoofs squeaked along the wet stone tiles, causing her to skid along the ground and crash into the nearest part of the pool, showering water over both her fellow bathers and an attendant that was walking by with fresh towels. Morel popped up from the water almost as quickly as she had gone under, standing navel-high in the water and cursing under her breath. Laughing, Emily slid in beside her, finding an outcropped stone seat to settle on while the heated water steamed around her.
Impressive.
Emily looked to her left as Morel knelt down in the water, having been given a set of weighted foam pads by a Caturcanach that had run over with them, and beside Emily was an older elf woman. Emily reckoned she must be at least 50 years old, judging by the look in her eyes and the streaks of white in her brown hair, but one could never tell with elves.
What's that?
Emily asked, pulling her arms from the water and settling them along the rim of the wall behind her.
Those scars. I've seen veterans of multiple wars with far less. Who did you serve under?
The elf asked, stretching her back with a crackle of muscles while pushing her chest out. Emily noticed that her right breast bore a long scar of its own. It must have been some kind of animal that scratched her, judging by the long old rake marks.
Just on a dive, and it was all mostly one fight if you can believe it.
The elf raised her brows, while other women of multiple races slowly began to focus their attention on Emily.
One battle, and yet you got all those scars? How many of foe were you fighting?
You know, I don't actually remember. It was all more or less a violent blur,
Emily murmured, but Morel splashed some water on her face before turning to look at the elf.
It was an entire camp of cultists. They had just butchered a happy messenger and were about to do the same to me. Emily more or less took them all single-handedly.
Single-handedly? My, you must have been quite the warrior to do all that on your own.
Yes, Torek, I'm aware the only reason we're both alive is because of you, but we can't go letting strangers know what I'm wearing around my neck.
Of course not. By all means, take credit for my help,
the Torque said, its voice dripping with sarcasm and humor.
Impressive indeed. What brings you all the way to Las Vegas?
The elf asked, and crossed her legs idly under the water.
More work, mostly,
Emily replied, looking over to Morel with unsure eyes.
A human female diver who can single-handedly take down an entire camp on her own and survive such wounds has come to Las Vegas for work.
the elf said softly, turning her head to look at a nearby female dwarf who was idly braiding her long sideburns. The dwarf said nothing, but eyed Emily curiously as she finished off a braid. All kinds of folk come to Las Vegas for work, said another human who was wiggling her toes through the surface of the water. After all, lots of things happen here in Vegas. Security details, missions out past the old waste.
Or in the sewers,
said the elf, sliding closer to Emily as she said this. Muriel, seeing Emily's eyes, looked towards the elf. What's in the sewers?
no one is sure. Very few common people come back from there. And now suddenly veteran divers and adventurers are showing up in droves, hired by those who have no name. How curious.
The elf murmured, leaning over and looking at Emily's heavily scarred arm.
Yep, really weird. Anyway, I'm gonna be over there.
Emily said hurriedly and scooted off the raised underwater seat to make her way towards Muriel, using the centaur as a sight blocker to where the elf was. Emily sighed and leaned against Muriel's flank, sinking down into the water slightly to blow bubbles. You okay? Muriel asked her, leaning towards Emily and placing a hand on her shoulder. Emily continued to blow bubbles in response, but she looked up at Muriel with eyes that said she was more annoyed than anything. Emily did not come around from the centaur until the elf realized she wasn't going to say anything else, and took her leave some minutes after. It seemed to Emily that she was not the only one here in Vegas that planned to go into the sewers, and she wasn't even sure what that really meant, or who worked for who, for that matter.
And that's the end of this chapter of Emily Bronze. This next month is going to be 2 chapters of Veil Riders and 2 chapters of Emily Bronze, 2 chapters of Veil Riders. I'm sure y'all have caught on to the system by now. If you like this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbeardia. Hit the bell icon so you know when the videos are released through the week, if YouTube even bothers to tell you. And if you really like the videos, like I said, please stop by the coffee and help donate to the channel or the narrators. If you want to donate to a particular narrator and only for them, all you have to do is put their name under donation and they get 100% of that donation. I do not take a cut. But yeah, I'm gonna try and stay on the horse as best I can for you guys. I might stumble a bit, I might be late, but I'm doing my best. It's all anyone can do, really, no matter how good or bad the day is. I appreciate you guys for sticking around, and hopefully I don't disappoint. This was the Beldam, this was Aristic, this was Eliza, and this is Garbeardia.